Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everybody. Good morning again to everybody online. I'm thankful for everybody who is here today. Thank you for setting this time aside to worship God, but also to be together as a family. Hope that it will be a blessing to everybody here. I want to begin with a story this morning. There was two friends who were walking along, and one is sharing with the other some struggles that he had been experiencing recently. And the other friend is listening, and he wants to be supportive. And so at one point, he just asks, "Can I give you just one word of advice?" And the first friend says, "Well, yeah, of course." And so the second fellow looks him right in the eye, and he says, "Plethora." And the second fellow, the other friend, just listens, and he starts to nod his head, and he says, "That means a lot." That was just to see if you're listening. Now, actually, there is a point to that story. Last week we said that even though we had reached the end of the book of John, that we would be circling back to two teachings of Jesus that came towards the end of his ministry. And the first has to do with how, from that point on, that Jesus' followers were to relate to him. And Jesus will use one word in that teaching there that means a lot. That literally means a lot, but it's very, very significant, in other words. And that's what we'll be looking at this morning. The second teaching, next week, Lord willing, has to do with how they were to relate to one another from that point on. And one reason that I feel okay about getting into these two teachings at the end of the series is because really I believe that these teachings meant a whole lot more to the disciples of Jesus after his ascension and his separation from them than when Jesus first shared him with them. And I hope that you'll see what I mean. So just to give you an idea of how I plan to approach it, there is really one central point that Jesus is making. And so we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about that, and then at the end we'll make a few quick points. We are in John chapter 15, if you'd like to follow along in your own Bible. We are in a section of John that is sometimes called the Upper Room Discourse, or sometimes it's called the Farewell Discourse. It's found only in John, and it spans 5 chapters in John, though it only covers the space of a few hours on a single Thursday evening. Now, to give you a little bit of the setting, at the end, the last thing that is said in chapter 14, Jesus has just said, "Come now, let us leave." All right. The Passover meal is finished, but the conversation is not over. And most people sort of guess that what happens next takes place while they're still in that upper room in the house, though some would speculate that it could have happened as the group left that place, left the house, and walked toward Gethsemane to pray, where they were heading. And that would mean that it's possible that this took place somewhere along the Kidron Valley, which is that space in between going out on the eastern side of the city of Jerusalem, and could have even taken place in an actual vineyard, though that area is a little bit better known for growing olives than it is for growing grapes. So either still in the upper room or somewhere along the way, Jesus gives them instructions for a lifetime. And this is definitely instruction that has to do with having the fullness of life. Again, that's been the theme of our series, and so I hope that you'll keep that in mind as we listen to Jesus teach this morning. He wants to give us instruction that's going to give us fullness or abundance of life. And so he begins by saying, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. So this is the central image that we're dealing with in chapter 15 here. Jesus says, I am the true vine. My Father is the gardener, or the vine dresser, other translations will say. And he uses an image here, the vine, which would have been familiar to everyone in that culture. I mean, there were vineyards everywhere, and wine from the grape was, probably the most common drink. But in addition to that, he chooses the symbol of the vine because it was one of the major symbols for Israel in the Old Testament as either the vine or the vineyard. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. For instance, Jeremiah 2:21, God is speaking here about his people through the prophet. He says, I had planted you like a choice vine of sound and reliable stock. How then did you turn against me into a corrupt wild vine? Okay. So again, this is God's description and his word choice about how he sees his people. You were a vine, okay? You turned out to be a wild vine, so you weren't obedient, you were rebellious, but a vine nonetheless is the analogy. Also in Psalm 80, this is verse 8 and 9. It says, you transplanted a vine from Egypt. Okay, obviously talking about the time that through Moses that Israel was delivered into the promised land. You transplanted a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and you planted it. You cleared the ground for it, and it took root and it filled the land. So just a couple of examples of that. Isaiah 5 is another good example of it, of Israel being spoken of as the vine. Now, what's more, as you entered the temple in Jerusalem, on one of the walls, there was a massive decoration made of gold in the shape of a grapevine. The historian Josephus describes a magnificent golden vine that hung over one of the inner portals of the second temple, that is, of Solomon's temple. So, sorry, not Solomon's temple, but the one that would have been there at the time of Jesus. So the term vine was meant to be a reminder to the disciples of these Old Testament texts that spoke of God's people as a vine. Okay? So Jesus is deliberate about his word choice here. But so many times we see the images like this in the Old Testament that they were so powerful in their original context, but at the same time, they were meant to point us to something even greater. Now, here's what I mean by that. For instance, the Passover, or the Passover meal. I mean, this was so central to the Jewish faith. It continues to be so central to the Jewish faith, as it symbolized that night when the angel of death passed over the houses of the Israelites, and God faithfully delivered his people out of Egypt and into freedom. And yet, that event and the celebration of it, as great as that was just a foreshadow of what was to come. The foreshadow of something else that God was pointing to through that. Passover reaches even greater fulfillment as Jesus comes and becomes the Passover lamb. In fact, Jesus becomes both the high priest who offers the sacrifice as well as being the perfect atoning sacrifice himself. So he is the priest who offers himself as a gift or as an atonement. The first Passover was focused on Israel, but the second one, the true Passover in Jesus, like we celebrated last week, like Nick mentioned, was for the whole world. And so that ancient event was pointing to something even greater that was to come. So Jesus is the ultimate Passover, as well as a number of other images, great images, outstanding images that we could choose from the Old Testament, like Jesus is the true faithful remnant that is spoken about in the Old Testament. It refers to God's people. Ultimately, though, he is the faithful one. He is the final high priest, although there were great high priests in the Old Testament. There were great kings like David in the Old Testament, but Jesus is king over all kings. And so here again in John 15, Jesus opens the minds of his followers in order to help them to understand what the scriptures have been saying all along. Yes, you know that God's people, Israel, are spoken of as a vine. Okay, as he speaks to his disciples that night, God's people are spoken of as a vine, but I am the true vine, or the greater vine, the ultimate vine. This, by the way, is the seventh of the 7 I am statements in John's gospel. You may have been wondering when that's going to come up. This is it. This is the last of them. So, applied to Jesus, that term, the vine, means that he is the one through whom the fruit of God has been and will be produced in the world. So what Israel could not do, because of their sin, because of their rebellion, in being the vine of God, Jesus has done. Now, let's think about that in terms of what that is saying to that group of people, either in the room or along the way, out in the valley that night. Jesus is about to suffer at the hands of his own people. Not long after that, he's going to return to the Father. Yet he wants them to be completely confident, totally assured that despite the physical separation, that they will still be connected to him and he to them. The vine and the branches is a symbol of absolute dependence on the Lord. Even more so than, say, some of the other images that Jesus has used in the book of John. For instance, the image of the shepherd and the sheep. Sheep can exist without a shepherd, right? Maybe not for very long, and maybe a kind of a precarious existence, while they have it. But it is possible for them to exist without a shepherd. There are, goats and other flock animals that do exist in the wild. But you cannot go out and find random branches growing in nature by themselves, right? If you see a random branch on the ground, it's because it is dead. If they're not connected to a tree or a vine, it means there's no life in them. They're dead. There's no other real options here. The vine is not just a supplement to the life of the branch. It is actually the source. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at here as he chooses this particular metaphor. That's how serious Jesus intends this statement to be for his disciples, both then and now. If we are serious about following Jesus, we have to adjust our mentality. Jesus is not just something that you add to your life to improve it, like a vitamin supplement or a lucky charm or having some new experience, somehow to enhance your life. Jesus has no interest in being an add-on or a supplement to your life. He wants to be the source of it. That our relationship to him should be like that of a branch to the vine. And then in verse 2, Jesus says that the gardener or vine dresser, who is the Father, he will cut off the branches that bear no fruit, while those that do, he does what? Well, he prunes them, or he cleans them so that they'll produce more fruit. Anybody here already been involved in that this spring? Been outside, done any cleaning, any pruning, of some of the things in your yard? That's what God does. The fruitless branches represent people who profess maybe to believe in Jesus, but their actions demonstrate that their connection to Jesus is only superficial at best. We have been meeting people like that all along as we've been reading through the book of John. Lots of people, lots of crowds who follow. Some are even said to believe in him, and yet at some point they turn away. Probably the prime example of that, as John tells it, is Judas, right? Who, by all outward appearance, seemed to be a follower of Jesus, seemed to be connected to the vine, and yet in the end, he was fruitless, he was cut off. Fruitful branches, on the other hand, are those who have proven their faith in Jesus to be genuine by remaining in him. An example, again, from John might be Nicodemus, who Jesus first encounters in John chapter 3, but we're not really sure, where Nicodemus stands in his belief in Jesus. It's kind of left open. And then John, much later in the book, will pick up that thread, and he'll show that Nicodemus is still standing with Jesus, even in his crucifixion, even in his death. But it raises a question, I think, for us. Hope it does for you. Am I a fruitless branch or a fruitful branch? It seems like a reasonable question to ask in light of what Jesus is saying here. Am I a fruitless branch or a fruitful branch? How can I know for sure? Well, we can raise these questions at least. Are you still pursuing Jesus? Not perfectly. Everybody knows that. Nobody hopefully claims that you're doing that perfectly. Okay? You're sinning every day, all right? You're failing in one way or another in your pursuit of Jesus, but are you still pursuing him? Is it still the desire of your heart to belong to him, to be connected to him? That's one way that you can tell. Another is God still pruning you. It's another way that you can tell. I know that often sounds like a bad thing, the thought of God pruning me. What's he going to do, to prune me? But we all need it, do we not? And it's a really good thing that God does that. And how does he do that? Well, again, verse 3, Jesus says one of the ways that he does that, he says, you are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Now, I think there, the word that I have spoken to you, again, verse 3, refers to the word of the gospel that saves us, and it is what connects us to God, to Jesus in the first place. Back in chapter 6 of John, Jesus has said, the words I have spoken to you, they are spirit, and they are life. Right? So these are the things that, again, put us in connection with Jesus to begin with, but they're also what continues to clean or to purge or to purify our lives, as long as those words abide with us. After that, though, after we are initially connected to him, then the Lord continues to correct us and to train us in what is good. We know that, again, he does that by using the word. 2 Timothy 3:16 says that. We know that every day God also uses circumstances in our lives, does he not, to purify us, to build us up. Happy times as well as hardships. You know, we probably, if we were given the choice, we'd want to choose the happy times, you know, to be the thing that really shapes our lives. But God uses the other things too, right? Even the hardships, God uses to prune us, to clean us, to shape us. But in order for that to become a reality in our lives, in order for that growth, that transforming change to transpire, there is a key word that Jesus speaks to them. In verse 4, Jesus says, "Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." What a picture this is. This is not you sit there and I'll boss you around and tell you what to do. It is a picture, okay, of mutual relationship, of mutual dwelling. Jesus says, "You abide in me, but I will also abide in you. I'll remain with you. Even though I'm leaving soon, physically, my relationship to you will never end. Even though you and I have never related to Jesus in that physical sense of having seen him. Yet, he says, my relationship to you will never end. We will always be connected. What is to come from this point forward in your life will be the result of our union together. Now, what Jesus has in mind here is the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Christ, who will come in and dwell in them. By the end of the chapter, he will begin to talk about that. But this is how they, the branches, will abide in the vine, and he will abide in them. Well, that brings us back to our little story at the start of the message. One word that Jesus spoke that means a lot. A single word that I hope that you'll take away with you today, even if that's the only word that you take away. And it's not the word plethora, by the way, but it is the word abide. Your translation might say, stay united with me, stay joined to me, live in me. I'm sure there are plenty of others. But it's not a hard word to understand, I don't think. It's a pretty straightforward command, is it not? To stick with me. We can make it more complicated than that. We can put unnecessary pressure on ourselves and sometimes even on other people to be different, to produce the fruit of God in their lives. But, you know, here's something that's never happened. You've never been walking out in your yard and snuck up on a branch of a tree in your yard and hear it or see it grit its teeth, as if branches could have teeth, and say, I'm going to produce some fruit. Right? It doesn't work like that. It doesn't need to. There is an organic process that naturally flows and develops and produces fruit as long as the connection is there. What will happen in the lives, it's what will happen in the lives of people who abide, who don't turn away. Even when they stumble, even when they fail, they don't turn away. They keep turning back to Jesus, and they stay connected to him. Jesus says, in the life of that person, they will bear much fruit. Clearly, there is an expectation of the Lord that we will have productive lives here, right? But sometimes, at least I'll say from my own experience, that's the only thing I hear. Man, I've got to produce fruit. How do I do that? How do I work harder? Do I work smarter? What's he talking about here? But notice Jesus' words are not spoken as a threat. They are spoken as a promise. For those who stick with him, who keep walking with him, he promises fruit bearing will happen. Now, by the way, the New Testament speaks of fruit bearing in two different ways. There's, for example, in Galatians 5, there's the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Okay, those things that the Spirit produces in the life of a person, the character of Jesus. But as well, fruit can also refer in the New Testament to the mission that we have, to joining with Jesus in the harvest of souls, if you will. That metaphor is used to apply to that as well. Paul uses it in that sense in a different letter in Colossians 1, where he says, in the same way, the gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world, just as it has been doing among you since the day you heard it and truly understood God's grace. So Paul, I think pretty evidently, he's talking about the spread of the gospel there and more people coming to Christ. So it's used in both ways, but which one is Jesus talking about in John 15? And the answer is yes. Yes. I believe he's talking about both. They tend to go hand in hand, do they not? As long as we continue to be nourished by our attachment to Jesus, first of all, our own lives will be transformed. But as that happens, we can be sure, I think this is part of Jesus' promise here, that we can be sure that the Lord will use it to influence and draw others into a saving relationship with himself. Now, your primary gift may not be as an evangelist or a teacher, but God will still use you in the mission of bringing those in the world back to himself. And so in that sense, we all participate, I think, in both aspects of bearing fruit. But back to John 15. At this point, okay, in light of what the disciples have heard, in light of what we've read here, I just want to ask us sincerely, because I've found out that a lot of people find anxiety in this passage instead of peace. Can we just trust God to fulfill what he has promised here? Can we trust that if he said it will be so, that it will be so? Now, I'm not saying we just need to be passive, all right? Nothing we need to do here. I'm not saying we shouldn't pray about having fruitful lives, or I'm not saying that we shouldn't keep absorbing God's word, or that we shouldn't do our best to cooperate with the work that God is trying to do in our hearts. Of course we should. Those, in fact, are all ways that we do abide with the Lord, right? Is through humbling ourselves in prayer, through absorbing his word into our lives, through seeing what God is doing in the circumstances of life and not resisting the pruning, right? Not whining and complaining to the Lord about it, but trying to understand, trying to discern his hand and say, Lord, what are you teaching me here? What is it I need to learn from this? So all those are ways that we abide in the vine. And of course, we should do all those things. But what Jesus doesn't say is, abide in me and fret. Okay? Remain in me and worry without ceasing. Right? Now, in the next verse, Jesus does say, If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. And I don't have that verse, which is very unfortunate. Look for that in your own Bible, though, verse 6. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. Okay? Now that can sound a little threatening, can it? I sure don't want to be one of those branches. What if I'm not bearing enough fruit? What if my fruit isn't shiny enough or whatever? But look again, and again you have to find this in your own Bible here, verse 6. Jesus did not say, whoever doesn't bear fruit will be thrown away. Now I think that's a significant thing. Jesus did not say whoever doesn't bear fruit will be thrown away. He says, if you don't remain in me, whoever doesn't abide in the vine will be a branch that is thrown away. I think there's a significant difference there, okay? Jesus is saying that those who choose to turn away, they will be the ones who are bundled up and cast away. But for those who continue to choose him, the promise is that he will work in our lives to bear fruit. And if there's a voice that whispers in your head right now, I don't think I can produce fruit in my life the way God wants me to, I'm not adequate for it, then congratulations, you have just grasped Jesus' point. You aren't adequate. I'm not adequate. Okay? That's why Jesus says, apart from him, you can do nothing. Consequently, if someone was to ask, what is one thing that I should focus on from now on in light of what Jesus taught his first followers here, it would not be to focus on bearing fruit. If you want to obsess or focus, if you will, on something, focus on what Jesus says, abiding in him. Because that, Jesus says, is how fruit comes. Not by focusing on bearing fruit, but focusing on remaining attached to him, feeding on him, finding the source of our life in him. Reflect on that. Pray about that. And if that means that you have to restructure your time or your priorities in order for that to happen, if it's just too hard right now finding that space to abide in Jesus day by day, then it may mean that. We've got some restructuring that we've got to do. And if that's, the case for you, then, may the Holy Spirit be your helper in doing that and changing that this week. There is so much more to meditate on in this chapter. And, of course, I want to encourage you to do that. I want to encourage you to read on through the rest of it this week as you abide in Jesus. But there's 3 verses that I want to highlight quickly as we conclude that I hope will fuel your desire to do just that, to abide in the Lord this week. The first one is verse 8, where Jesus says, "This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." Notice here with Jesus that bearing fruit, first of all, is about being, not doing. It's not, what can I rush out, and get engaged in, get involved in so that I can produce fruit. It is first of all about being, showing yourselves to be my disciples, to be my disciples. What does Jesus say? I am the vine, you are the branches. See, Jesus doesn't skip over this step. What needs to happen, first of all, is for us to see Jesus redefining how we even think about ourselves. There's a writer named James Clear. He wrote a really popular book called Atomic Habits. Some of you may have read that. I don't know. But put in his words, he says, real lasting behavior change begins with identity change. In other words, you have to think differently about yourself before you can produce lasting behavioral change in yourself. Okay? If you think of yourself only as, well, I'm this addict, I'm trapped in these circles of addiction and these cycles of bad habits, and I just can't get out of them. Well, if that's the way that you see yourself, define your being, it's going to be really difficult to move beyond that. When a person can get to the point where they realize, no, I'm somebody made in God's image, and even though I'm having some troubles right now, I'm failing right now, I'm weak, yet I see something greater that God has made me to be, then they can begin to change behavior in a way that will last. They say the same thing applied to, say, runners. Somebody wants to become, let's say, a marathon runner. The way to go about that is not just to say, well, I'm going to train for this marathon. I'm going to change my diet. I'm going to change my exercise habits. I'm going to get up earlier, this and that. Those things need to occur. But for someone to really succeed at doing that, they need to first begin to understand themselves as, I am a runner. See, I'm not just somebody who's trying to achieve this goal of running a particular race, but I am a runner. And so I begin to change my behavior in line with who I understand myself to be. Point being, Jesus says, when you think about yourself, realize I am a branch of the true vine. That's what God made me to be. And for fruit to be manifested through my life. And the behavior changes that need to happen, they will, as long as we stay connected to Him. But we need to understand that about ourselves first. Not just, I'm going to go out and do this, but this is who God made me to be. And then let the actions follow. Secondly, verse 9, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now, remain in my love. Understand that the nature of this is not just a sense of duty. It comes out of the profound love of God for us. If you're looking for something to focus on as you abide in Jesus this week, think about that. Jesus says, the love with which the Father loved me, I have loved you. Wow. The love with which the Father loved the Son, what's that like? I mean, it's unimaginable, isn't it, for us? And Jesus says, that's how I have loved you. No beginning, no end, without measure. God, forgive us and spare us from treating the love of God for us like a small thing. It's not. It's beyond what we can even comprehend. But nonetheless, this is why Jesus calls us to abide in Him and therefore to produce fruit. Number 3, verse 10, if you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in His love. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. It's another way of saying what Jesus has been saying throughout the Gospel of John, I've come that people may have life and may have it to the full, abundantly. Jesus wants us to have utter, complete, unshakable joy. So, why does Jesus want you to focus on remaining in him and learning how to do that better and better, as you walk with him day in and day out, so that he can test you, so he can point out where you did wrong? According to this, Jesus says, I tell you these things so that your joy, that my joy, the joy I have, may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. For anyone who sits on the fence, just partially committed to Jesus, but still, in a way, still kind of tied to the world or tied to your old habits, still wanting to hold on to my will, my agenda, you can never experience that kind of joy. I always picture in my mind the barbed wire fence. If you're trying to get over the barbed wire fence, and yet you're sitting on the fence, and you're still trying to decide which way to come down, one side or the other. Well, that's really an uncomfortable place to be, all right? And what Jesus is saying here is that we cannot know that fullness of joy while we are still trying to remain tied to our old life or tied to this world. Jesus says, I do want you to know what is pure, what is utter, what is the fullness of joy. But that comes when you make the commitment to come down off of that fence onto the side of remaining in me and choosing me and continuing to do that. So, well, the best part of this lesson will come as you choose to do that this week. So God bless you in doing that.